In the autumn of 52 before Christ, a Roman army found itself in a situation that defied all military logic. 10 legions, approximately 40,000 battle-hardened soldiers, stood encircled by a Celtic coalition numbering close to 300,000 warriors. The Romans had built walls to contain their enemy, only to find themselves trapped between those very fortifications and a relief force that dwarfed their numbers by 7 to 1. Every principle of warfare suggested annihilation was inevitable. Yet within 60 days the impossible would unfold on the hills of Gaul, and the course of Western civilization would pivot on the actions of one man and his legions in a place called Alesia. Before we embark on this extraordinary journey through one of history's most remarkable military campaigns, join our channel community. Subscribe and activate notifications to ensure you never miss the incredible stories we bring to you each week. The plateau of Alesia rose from the Gallic landscape like a natural fortress, its limestone cliffs ascending sharply from the surrounding valleys. Two rivers, the Ouse and the Oseraine, carved their paths around the base of this elevated stronghold, creating natural moat barriers that had protected settlements here for generations. On the plateau's summit, the Mandubi tribe had built their oppidum, a fortified town of stone and timber that housed thousands of souls. The air carried the scent of wood smoke and autumn harvest, mixing with the metallic tang that always preceded warfare. Oak and beech forests blanketed the surrounding hills, their leaves beginning to turn gold and crimson as the season shifted toward winter. The wind sweeping across the plateau brought with it the distant sounds of an army in motion, the grinding of wagon wheels, the rhythmic march of tens of thousands of feet, the restless stirring of cavalry horses sensing the tension that permeated the very air. Julius Caesar stood upon a hillside, overlooking this natural fortress, his scarlet cloak marking him as proconsul of Rome even from a great distance. At 52 years of age, he had spent 8 years subduing Gaul, transforming scattered tribal territories into Roman provinces. His face bore the weathered lines of countless campaigns, and his eyes possessed the calculating intensity of a mind that viewed terrain as a chessboard of tactical possibilities. Behind him stretched 10 legions of Roman infantry, each legion comprising roughly 4,000 men organized into centuries and cohorts. These soldiers wore segmented armor of iron plates, carried rectangular shields painted with their unit insignia, and wielded the gladius, the short sword that had conquered most of the known world. They had marched from Britannia to the Rhine, from the Atlantic coast to the Alps, following Caesar through victories that had made his name legendary in Rome, and feared throughout the Celtic territories. The man who now challenged Rome's dominance in Gaul bore a name that would echo through centuries: Vercingetorix. The young Arverni chieftain had accomplished what no Celtic leader before him had achieved, uniting the fractious tribes of Gaul under a single military command. He stood at the gates of Alesia, watching the Roman approach with eyes that burned with determination. At approximately 30 years of age, Vercingetorix combined the warrior traditions of his people with tactical innovations learned from studying Roman methods. He wore the torque of gold around his neck, symbol of nobility among the Celts, and carried weapons forged by the finest smiths of Gaul. His hair, worn long in the Celtic fashion, was bound back for battle. Around him gathered the warriors of a dozen tribes: the Arverni, the Aedui, who had broken their alliance with Rome, the Senones, the Carnutes, and others who had answered his call to drive the invaders from their ancestral lands. These men carried long swords, oval shields, decorated with intricate Celtic designs, and wore chainmail armor that Celtic smiths had perfected generations before Rome adopted the technique. The events that brought these forces to Alesia had unfolded across a brutal campaigning season. Vercingetorix had employed a strategy of scorched earth, denying Caesar's legions the supplies they needed to maintain their invasion. Town after town had been burned by the Gauls themselves, sacrificing their own settlements to starve the Roman war machine. The tactic had nearly succeeded, driving Caesar's army to the brink of starvation and forcing him to request grain from allied tribes who were increasingly reluctant to support Rome against their Celtic kinsmen. Then came the siege of Avaricum, where Caesar's legions had stormed the walls and slaughtered 40,000 Gallic civilians in retribution for the hardships endured during the winter campaign. The massacre had hardened Gallic resolve, transforming a rebellion into a war of survival. Vercingetorix had retreated to Gergovia, his tribal capital, and dealt Caesar a stinging defeat, killing 700 legionaries and forcing the Roman commander to withdraw. It marked one of Caesar's few tactical failures in Gaul, and it emboldened the Celtic Confederation. But Caesar could not withdraw from Gaul entirely without destroying his political future in Rome. His enemies in the Senate awaited any sign of weakness, any opportunity to prosecute him for exceeding his authority during 8 years of conquest. He needed a decisive victory, a triumph so complete that it would silence his critics and secure his position. Vercingetorix needed time to consolidate his forces and wear down Roman resolve through extended campaigning. Both commanders understood that the coming confrontation would determine not just the fate of Gaul, but the balance of power in the Republic itself. The collision course between these objectives led both armies to the plateau of Alesia, where geography would become as much an enemy as the opposing forces. Vercingetorix chose Alesia for sound tactical reasons. The elevated position provided natural defensive advantages, making direct assault prohibitively costly for attackers. The oppidum possessed supplies sufficient to maintain a large garrison through an extended siege. Most importantly, the location stood along major routes through central Gaul, positioned where a relief force could reach it from multiple directions. The Gallic commander believed he could withstand a Roman siege while his messengers summoned every available warrior from the Confederation. Once the relief army arrived, Caesar's legions would find themselves crushed between the defenders on the plateau and the relieving host approaching from outside. The logic appeared sound, based on conventional siege warfare principles that had governed military operations for centuries. Caesar, however, did not conduct conventional sieges. As his legions surrounded the base of Alesia's plateau, Roman engineering corps began the most audacious construction project in ancient military history. The proconsul ordered the construction of a complete circumvallation, a continuous fortification line entirely encircling the enemy position. The wall would stretch for 11 miles around the perimeter of Alesia, incorporating the terrain features into an integrated defensive system. But Caesar went further, ordering a second fortification line facing outward, a contravallation, designed to protect his army from attack from the rear. This outer wall would span 14 miles of Gallic countryside, creating a double ring of fortifications with the Roman legions holding the narrow space between them. The scale of the project staggered even experienced military engineers. Building 25 miles of fortifications while maintaining siege operations and defending against sorties from the besieged garrison would require every skill the legions possessed. The Roman soldiers, transformed into construction workers, though they never set aside their weapons while they labored. Each legion received its assigned section of the fortification lines, and centuries competed to complete their portions with speed and excellence. The basic wall stood 12 feet high, constructed from earth and timber with regular intervals of wooden towers, rising another story above the wall height. Before the main wall, the engineers excavated a trench 20 feet wide and as many deep, its sides cut vertically to prevent easy crossing. The earth removed from this trench provided material for the rampart behind it. Beyond the main fortifications, the Romans deployed a terrifying array of obstacles designed to break infantry charges and cavalry attacks. They called these defenses by names that reflected their lethal purposes. The stimuli, sharpened stakes concealed in shallow pits. The cipi, logs embedded in the ground at angles to impale charging men. The lilia, covered pits, containing sharpened stakes at the bottom. And the tribuli, iron caltrops scattered across approach routes to cripple men and horses. These obstacles extended outward from both walls, creating killing zones that would channel attackers into designated approaches where Roman artillery could concentrate its fire. The fortifications incorporated watchtowers positioned at 300-foot intervals, each tower staffed by sentries who maintained constant vigilance. Between the double walls, the legions established their camps in the standard Roman military layout. each camp a miniature fortress with its own defenses, supply dumps, and command structure. Caesar positioned his headquarters on a rise that provided clear views of both the inner and outer fortification lines, allowing him to observe developments on either front and dispatch reserves wherever the situation demanded. The camps housed not just the fighting legions, but also thousands of auxiliary troops, Germanic cavalry that Caesar had recruited to counter the superior Gallic horsemen, engineers, slaves who served the legions, and camp followers who performed essential support functions. The entire Roman presence at Alesia numbered close to 70,000 souls, all dependent on supply lines that stretched back through increasingly hostile territory. Vercingetorix observed this construction with growing alarm. He had expected a conventional blockade, perhaps some siege towers and rams directed against Alesia's walls. Instead, he watched the Romans building fortifications that would transform his stronghold into a prison. The Gallic commander recognized that once those double walls reached completion, relief forces would face a nearly impossible tactical challenge. They would need to breach fortified lines manned by Roman legionaries fighting from prepared positions, all while the defenders on Alesia attempted to break out from the inner fortifications. Even with overwhelming numerical superiority, coordinating such an assault would test the limits of Gallic military organization. Vercingetorix made the decision to launch his cavalry before the encirclement closed completely. The Gallic cavalry sortie erupted from Alesia in a thunderous wave of horses and men. 15,000 Celtic horsemen descended from the plateau, aiming to break through the incomplete Roman lines and carry messengers to summon the relief army. The Gallic cavalry represented the finest mounted warriors in Europe. Men, born to the saddle who rode without stirrups yet controlled their mounts with extraordinary skill. They wore brightly colored tunics and cloaks, carried long spears and swords, and rode horses bred for generations for stamina and courage. The charge caught one section of the Roman line during the construction phase, when fortifications remained incomplete and legionaries stood vulnerable. For several hours, a fierce cavalry battle raged across the fields surrounding Alesia, with Germanic auxiliary cavalry that Caesar had recruited engaging the Gallic riders in swirling melees, where individual skill counted as much as unit cohesion. Caesar committed his Germanic cavalry at the critical moment, fresh riders who crashed into the Gallic flank, just as the Celtic horsemen seemed poised to break through. The Germanic warriors fought with savage intensity, many dismounting to fight on foot when their horses fell, using long spears to drag Gallic riders from their saddles. The battle's tide turned gradually as the disciplined Germanic formations wore down the individual bravery of the Gallic warriors. By nightfall, Vercingetorix recalled his cavalry, having achieved his primary objective. Messengers had escaped through the gaps in the Roman lines, riding hard through the darkness to reach the distant tribes and summon the relief force. But the sortie had cost him dearly, with over 3,000 cavalry lost, and the survivors too exhausted and diminished to attempt another breakout. The remaining Gallic horsemen inside Alesia represented mouths to feed without corresponding military value, now that the encirclement had closed. Vercingetorix made the painful decision to send them away before the Roman walls completely sealed the plateau. The 80,000 warriors who remained within Alesia settled into siege routine as the autumn days shortened. Food supplies that had seemed adequate for a normal garrison now needed to stretch across an unknown duration. The Mandubi civilians who called Alesia home found themselves trapped alongside the warriors, their own supplies commandeered for the military effort. Vercingetorix implemented strict rationing, knowing that hunger would become as dangerous as Roman weapons if the siege extended into winter. The defenders maintained constant watch on the Roman lines, launching periodic probing attacks to test the fortifications and prevent the legionaries from growing complacent. Gallic warriors hurled javelins and stones at the Romans working on the walls, attempting to slow the construction and inflict casualties. Roman artillery responded with ballista bolts and stones launched from onagers, the torsion-powered catapults that could hurl projectiles with devastating accuracy. The daily attrition cost both sides men they could not replace, but the arithmetic favored Rome. The legions could rotate exhausted units away from the front lines, while the defenders possessed no such luxury. While the defenders endured privation and declining morale, messengers raced across Gaul carrying Vercingetorix's appeal for aid. The summons reached every tribe of the Confederation, calling them to send every available warrior to Alesia. The response exceeded even optimistic expectations. From the Atlantic coast to the Rhine Valley, from the Pyrenees to the English Channel, the tribes of Gaul mobilized their fighting men. The Aedui, once Rome's staunchest allies in the region, contributed 35,000 warriors. The Arverni sent the same number, determined to rescue their captured chieftain. The Senones, Sequani, Bituriges, and dozens of other tribes added their contingents until the relief army approached 250,000 warriors. Additionally, the Confederation mustered 8,000 cavalry, the survivors of earlier battles supplemented by fresh riders from tribes not previously engaged in the rebellion. This immense host gathered at a staging area, then began the march toward Alesia, moving with the ponderous inevitability of an avalanche. Caesar received intelligence of the relief army's approach through his network of scouts and spies. The numbers they reported would have broken the nerve of lesser commanders. His 40,000 legionaries would face attackers on two fronts, with total enemy numbers exceeding 300,000. The mathematics of the situation appeared insurmountable. Even if every Roman soldier killed 10 enemies, the defenders would still overwhelm them through sheer mass. But Caesar had spent his entire career defying such calculations through superior discipline, preparation, and the ruthless exploitation of every advantage terrain and fortifications could provide. He assembled his officers and laid out the defensive plan. The legions would man both walls simultaneously, rotating units between rest, guard duty, and rapid response reserves. Artillery would concentrate at key points, where attacks seemed most likely. The Germanic cavalry would patrol the spaces between the walls, ready to reinforce threatened sectors. Every soldier received orders to maintain strict discipline, to ignore the enemy numbers, and to trust in Roman training and the strength of their fortifications. The relief army arrived at Alesia on the 45th day of the siege. The Gallic host covered the landscape like a living sea, their campfires at night stretching as far as observers could see. The warriors shouted challenges at the Roman walls, beating their shields and swords together in a din that carried across the valley. On the plateau, the defenders of Alesia saw the arrival of their salvation and responded with their own thunderous cheers. For the first time in weeks, hope stirred among the garrison. Vercingetorix immediately dispatched messengers down the cliff faces under cover of darkness, using ropes to lower men who carried instructions for coordinating the assault. The plan called for simultaneous attacks from both the relief army and the breakout force from within Alesia, crushing the Romans between two massive assaults that would overwhelm the fortifications through sheer pressure of numbers. The first assault commenced at midday, with the relief army advancing against the outer Roman walls across a broad front. The Gallic warriors moved forward in dense masses, their shields overlapping, chanting war songs that their ancestors had sung for centuries. They reached the first line of Roman obstacles, and the carefully prepared killing zone exacted its terrible toll. Warriors stepped on concealed caltrops that drove iron spikes through feet and into bones, collapsing in agony and disrupting the formations behind them. Others fell into the Lilia pits, impaling themselves on sharpened stakes. The survivors pressed forward over the bodies of the fallen, only to encounter the second and third lines of obstacles. Roman artillery opened fire from the towers, launching iron-tipped bolts that could pierce 3 men, standing in line. The ballistae operated with mechanical precision, their crews trained to reload and fire with deadly efficiency. Stones hurled from onagers crashed into the packed Gallic ranks, each impact creating zones of destruction where bones shattered and bodies crumpled. Those warriors who survived the obstacle belts and artillery barrage reached the main Roman trench, only to find its vertical sides impossible to cross quickly. They attempted to fill sections with bundles of sticks and earth, creating causeways across which assault parties could advance. Roman legionaries massed behind their walls, waiting with pila ready. The heavy javelins launched in coordinated volleys, arcing over the fortifications to plunge down into the Gallic warriors attempting to cross the filled sections of trench. The pilum design featured a soft iron shank that bent upon impact, rendering shields useless and often pinning the shield to the warrior carrying it, forcing him to discard his primary defense. As the Gauls reached the walls themselves, they encountered legionaries fighting from elevated positions, using their gladi to deadly effect in the confined space. The short Roman sword proved ideal for the close-quarters combat at the fortification line, where longer Celtic weapons lacked room for proper swings. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix launched his breakout attempt from within Alesia. 80,000 warriors descended from the plateau, carrying scaling ladders, grappling hooks, and bundles of wood to fill the inner trenches. They advanced with desperate courage, knowing their survival depended on breaching the Roman lines and joining with the relief force. The defenders of Alesia had spent weeks observing these fortifications, identifying weak points and planning their assault routes. They concentrated their attack on 3 sections of the inner wall, where the terrain provided some cover for their approach. Roman sentries spotted the movement and raised the alarm. Cohorts rushed to the threatened sections, forming triple-deep lines behind the walls. The clash between the breakout force and the inner Roman defenses quickly matched the intensity of the fighting on the outer perimeter. Caesar rode between the 2 battle lines, his scarlet cloak visible wherever the fighting grew most intense. He deployed his reserves with the precision of a master tactician, dispatching cohorts to shore up buckling sections of wall, repositioning artillery to concentrate on emerging threats, constantly reading the battle's flow and adjusting his dispositions accordingly. The legionaries fighting on both walls could see their commander moving among them, sharing their danger, and his presence steadied nerves that might otherwise have broken under the pressure of facing such overwhelming odds. The Romans had trained for exactly this scenario during the construction phase, conducting drills that simulated simultaneous attacks from both directions. Now that training showed its value as units moved with practiced efficiency between the walls, responding to shouted orders and trumpet calls that cut through the battle's chaos. The first assault continued until darkness made coordinated action impossible. The Gallic forces withdrew, leaving thousands of their dead scattered across the approaches to the Roman fortifications. The obstacles that the legionaries had so laboriously emplaced had functioned exactly as designed, channeling the attackers into killing zones and disrupting their formations before they reached the main defenses. Yet the Romans recognized that the sheer weight of numbers would eventually tell if the Gauls maintained this pressure. The fortifications had held, but barely. Several sections of wall required immediate repairs where Gallic assault parties had nearly breached the defenses. Casualties among the legionaries mounted steadily, with each wounded man representing an irreplaceable loss that diminished Rome's fighting strength. In contrast, the vast Gallic army could absorb losses that would have shattered a smaller force and still maintain its offensive capability. Inside Alesia, food supplies reached critical levels. 45 days of siege had consumed the stored grain and preserved meat that the Mandubi had accumulated for winter. Vercingetorix faced a terrible choice. The garrison could continue consuming their remaining food while awaiting the relief army's success, but each day of waiting weakened the warriors who would need to fight in the final breakout. Alternatively, he could expel the civilians to preserve food for the fighters, condemning thousands of non-combatants to starvation between the lines. The Gallic commander chose the latter course, as ruthless as it was necessary from a military standpoint. The civilians of Alesia, thousands of men, women, and children, marched down from the plateau and approached the Roman inner wall, pleading for passage through the lines. They believed the Romans, who claimed to bring civilization to Gaul, would allow them to depart rather than witness their starvation. Caesar refused to permit the civilians passage. To do so would deplete the defenders' food supplies he was trying to exhaust, while simultaneously creating mouths for his own limited supplies to feed. The decision reflected the brutal arithmetic of siege warfare, where humanitarian considerations often surrendered to military necessity. The Mandubi civilians found Themselves trapped in the narrow space between the plateau they could no longer reach and the Roman wall that would not open for them. They camped in that killing ground, surviving on whatever grass and roots they could find, slowly weakening as starvation accomplished what Roman weapons had not. Their presence created an additional psychological burden for both the defenders above and the Romans manning the walls, a visible reminder of siege warfare's human cost. Some of the civilians died, within days, their bodies lying where they fell as neither side moved to collect them. The relief army's commanders studied the Roman fortifications and modified their tactical approach. The frontal assaults had failed to breach the defenses despite horrendous casualties. The Gallic leaders needed to find the weakest point in Caesar's elaborate defensive system and concentrate overwhelming force there before the Romans could shift reserves to counter the threat. Their scouts identified a section of the northwestern outer wall where the terrain limited the effectiveness of the obstacle belts and provided cover for an attacking force's approach. The ground rose gradually toward the fortifications, creating dead zones where Roman artillery could not depress their weapons sufficiently to engage the attackers. Additionally, the sector in question sat at the maximum distance from Caesar's central headquarters, requiring longer response times for Roman reserves to reach the fighting. The Gauls prepared their assault with uncharacteristic patience and organization. They massed 60,000 warriors in the forests beyond the Roman view, moving them into position during the night to avoid detection. Additionally, they positioned cavalry forces to engage the Germanic horsemen and prevent them from interfering with the main assault. The attack would commence before dawn, using darkness to mask the assault forces' approach until they reached the obstacle belts. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix prepared his own forces for a coordinated breakout, timed to coincide with the relief army's assault. Every available warrior received orders to attack at the signal, carrying prepared bundles of wood, ropes, ladders, and hooks. The Gallic commander understood this assault represented their final opportunity. Failure would mean slow death by starvation for the garrison and probable dissolution of the relief army as tribal contingents returned home for the winter. The attack erupted in the pre-dawn darkness with a ferocity that surpassed the earlier assaults. The 60,000 warriors of the relief army charged the northwestern section of outer fortifications, using the terrain to mask their approach until they reached the obstacle zones. They had prepared for the Roman traps with lead elements carrying shields to lay over the caltrops and bundles of wood to fill the lily pits. The advance parties suffered terrible losses clearing paths through the obstacles, but their sacrifice allowed following waves to maintain momentum. Roman sentries spotted the assault and raised the alarm, but the sheer speed and violence of the attack gave the defenders minimal time to prepare. The Gallic warriors reached the main trench, while darkness still covered the battlefield, limiting the effectiveness of Roman missile weapons. They hurled their prepared bundles into the trench, creating multiple causeways while their archers provided covering fire against the legionaries, manning the walls. Simultaneously, Vercingetorix launched his breakout from Alesia with every warrior under his command. The 80,000 defenders surged down from the plateau, hitting the inner Roman walls along their entire length. The dual assault forced Caesar to divide his attention and his reserves between two simultaneous crises. The legionaries holding the northwestern sector found themselves engaged in desperate hand-to-hand combat as Gallic warriors swarmed over the filled sections of trench and threw scaling ladders against the timber walls. The fortifications that had held firm during the earlier attacks now buckled under focused pressure at a vulnerable point. Gallic warriors gained footholds on the wall itself, fighting the legionaries in brutal close quarters where Roman discipline struggled against Celtic ferocity and numbers. Caesar recognized the northwestern sector's crisis, even as reports arrived describing Vercingetorix's all-out assault on the inner walls. The proconsul faced the defining decision of the entire campaign. If he dispatched too many reserves to shore up the northwestern sector, the defenders of Alesia might break through the inner walls. If he concentrated on containing Vercingetorix's breakout, the relief army would breach the outer fortifications and pour into the space between the walls. Either breakthrough would likely prove catastrophic, allowing the two Gallic forces to unite and overwhelm his divided legions. Caesar made his choice with the cold calculation that characterized his entire military career. He would hold the inner walls with minimal forces and commit everything available to crushing the northwestern assault before it achieved a decisive breakthrough. The proconsul led 6 cohorts of his veteran reserves personally, riding toward the embattled northwestern sector, while his scarlet cloak marked him for every soldier who needed to see their commander sharing their danger. As Caesar approached, he could see the situation's desperate nature. Sections of wall stood abandoned where defenders had fallen. Gallic warriors had established positions on the Roman side of the fortifications, and the discipline that held the legions together showed signs of fracturing under pressure. Caesar plunged into the thickest fighting, his presence electrifying the exhausted legionaries who had held the line through the night. The 6 veteran cohorts deployed with practiced efficiency, forming a line behind the breached sections and preparing to counterattack. Caesar gave the order and the veterans charged, slamming into the Gallic warriors who had breached the wall with the irresistible momentum of fresh troops, hitting exhausted attackers. While Caesar fought to restore the northwestern sector, he dispatched urgent orders to his cavalry commander, Labienus, directing him to gather all available mounted forces and launch an attack into the relief army's rear. Labienus assembled every Germanic, cavalryman and mounted legionary available, approximately 4,000 riders. This force rode around the Roman fortification line, using the forests and terrain to mask their movement, emerging behind the Gallic relief army at the critical moment. The sudden appearance of Roman cavalry in their rear caused panic among the Gallic warriors pressing the northwestern assault. Warriors turned to face this new threat, disrupting their attack's momentum and creating confusion in ranks that had been solely focused on breaching the fortifications. The psychological impact of the cavalry charge exceeded its actual military effect, as Celtic warriors found themselves caught between the counter-attacking legionaries to their front and Germanic cavalry to their rear. The northwestern sector assault collapsed as cohesion dissolved among the attackers. Warriors who moments before had seemed on the verge of breakthrough now retreated in growing disorder, abandoning their hard-won positions on the walls to escape the collapsing situation. The Germanic cavalry pursued with merciless efficiency, cutting down Gallic warriors who broke formation to flee. Labienus drove his cavalry deep into the relief army's rear formations, spreading panic and disruption far beyond the cavalry's actual reach. The tribal contingents that comprised the relief army lacked unified command structure strong enough to rally the fleeing warriors and organize a proper defense. Each tribal unit's chieftains made independent decisions about whether to stand or withdraw, leading to piecemeal collapses that accelerated the rout. On the inner walls, Vercingetorix witnessed the relief army's disintegration from the plateau of Alesia. The breakout assault he commanded had nearly breached several sections of inner wall, but without corresponding success from the relief army, continuing the attack meant only additional casualties without hope of decisive result. The Gallic commander faced the bitter reality that his gamble had failed. He ordered his forces to disengage and withdraw to the plateau, abandoning the scaling ladders and equipment that would no longer serve any purpose. The warriors of Alesia climbed back up the slopes in sullen exhaustion, their hope of liberation extinguished by the relief army's failure. The legionaries manning the inner walls were too exhausted to pursue, content to see the attackers withdraw and leave them in possession of fortifications that had barely held against the sustained assault. The relief army's defeat marked the effective end of organized resistance at Alesia. The tribal contingents that had marched with such confidence to rescue Vercingetorix now dispersed across Gaul, each group returning to its own territory before winter made travel impossible. The confederation that had unified Gaul against Rome dissolved as individual tribes prioritized their own survival over the collective cause. 8,000 Gallic warriors lay dead on the battlefield's outer approaches, while Roman casualties numbered less than 1,000 despite the desperate fighting. The disparity reflected not just the fortifications' effectiveness, but also the fundamental difference between the professional Roman military system and the Celtic warrior tradition. The legionaries fought as disciplined units executing coordinated tactics, while the Celtic warriors relied primarily on individual courage and skill that proved insufficient against prepared Positions and systematic defense. Inside Alesia, starvation reduced the garrison to skeletal shadows of the warriors who had entered the siege 6 weeks earlier. The expelled Mandubi civilians who had survived continued to waste away between the lines, their plight now irrelevant to both sides' military calculations. Food supplies within the oppidum reached absolute exhaustion. Warriors who weeks before could march and fight now lacked the strength to man the walls effectively. Disease began, spreading through the crowded settlement as weakened immune systems surrendered to the opportunistic infections that flourished in siege conditions. Vercingetorix called a council with his surviving chieftains to discuss the garrison's 3 remaining options. They could attempt a desperate breakout with their weakened forces, likely resulting in massacre during the retreat. They could remain within Alesia and die slowly of starvation and disease. Or they could surrender to Caesar and face whatever fate the Roman commander chose to impose. The Gallic commanders voted to surrender, selecting preservation of their remaining warriors over pointless deaths that would serve no military or political purpose. Vercingetorix assumed full responsibility for the rebellion, declaring that he had led the Confederation into war and therefore should face the consequences alone. The other chieftains rejected this sacrifice, recognizing that Caesar would likely demand the surrender of all leaders, regardless of Vercingetorix's noble gesture. They prepared to open negotiations with the Romans, sending envoys down from the plateau under truce banners to request terms. Caesar received the envoys at his headquarters camp, listening to their requests without revealing his intentions. The proconsul understood the political value of the moment. 8 years of Gallic campaigns culminated in this surrender, and how he handled Vercingetorix would send messages to Rome and to Gaul about his character and intentions. Caesar demanded unconditional surrender of all warriors within Alesia, to be delivered as captives who would face judgment for their rebellion against Roman authority. Additionally, he required the personal surrender of Vercingetorix, who would be transported to Rome to stand trial before the Senate. The terms left no room for negotiation, reflecting Caesar's recognition that any appearance of compromise might undermine the totality of his victory. The Gallic envoys returned to Alesia with these demands, and Vercingetorix accepted them without protest. The young chieftain who had united Gaul prepared himself for the final act of leadership he could perform for his people, offering himself as sacrifice to potentially secure better treatment for his warriors. The surrender ceremony occurred on the 60th day of the siege. Vercingetorix rode down from Alesia alone, mounted on a magnificent horse decorated with Celtic metalwork and wearing his finest armor and weapons. He approached Caesar's headquarters with dignity intact despite the circumstances, presenting himself as a warrior and chieftain worthy of respect, even in defeat. The Gallic leader dismounted before Caesar's platform, removed his weapons in the traditional gesture of surrender, and knelt before the Roman proconsul. Roman soldiers immediately seized him, binding his hands and leading him away to the captivity that would last 6 years before his final appearance in Caesar's triumph parade in Rome. Following Vercingetorix's surrender, the 80,000 surviving warriors of Alesia descended from the plateau and presented themselves as captives. Caesar distributed them among his legions as slaves, giving each legionary 1 captive as personal property, a traditional reward that enriched the soldiers who had endured the campaign's hardships. The battlefield around Alesia bore witness to the siege's ferocity. Tens of thousands of Gallic dead lay scattered across the approaches to the Roman fortifications, their bodies left where they fell as neither side possessed the resources or inclination to conduct proper burials. The elaborate obstacles that had consumed weeks of labor and served their purpose so effectively remained in place, monuments to Roman engineering and military methodology. The double walls that had contained and defeated an army 7 times larger than the defending force demonstrated the revolutionary combination of fortification, discipline, and tactical flexibility that made Roman legions the ancient world's most formidable military force. Caesar ordered his engineers to document the siege works in detail, recognizing that the successful defense of these fortifications under such extreme conditions represented innovations that would influence siege warfare for generations. The Mandubi civilians who had survived their ordeal between the lines received permission to return to what remained of their settlement on Alesia's plateau. They found their homes ransacked, their stored food consumed by the garrison, and their community reduced to a fraction of its pre-siege population. The Romans made no provision for feeding or assisting these survivors, considering their suffering an unfortunate but inevitable consequence of their tribal leader's decision to host Vercingetorix's forces. Many of the surviving Mandubi scattered to other tribal territories, seeking refuge among kinsmen who might help them survive the coming winter. Alesia itself would never fully recover its pre-siege prosperity, remaining a diminished settlement that served primarily as reminder of Rome's power and the cost of resistance. Caesar dispatched messages to Rome announcing the victory at Alesia and the surrender of Vercingetorix. The Senate declared 20 days of Thanksgiving celebrations, an unprecedented honor that recognized not just the military achievement, but also the political significance of finally subjugating Gaul. Caesar's enemies in the Senate found their positions weakened by success they could not deny or diminish. The proconsul had transformed a desperate situation into decisive victory through combination of engineering innovation, tactical skill, and the unwavering discipline of his legions. His commentaries on the Gallic Wars would devote extensive passages to describing the Alesia campaign, recognizing it as the culmination of 8 years of conquest, and the achievement that secured his reputation as one of history's great military commanders. The immediate aftermath of Alesia saw Caesar conducting pacification operations across Gaul during the following campaigning season. Several tribes attempted renewed resistance, hoping the Confederation's defeat represented temporary setback rather than permanent subjugation. Caesar methodically crushed these final rebellions, demonstrating that Roman dominance of Gaul would persist regardless of individual tribal ambitions. He pardoned some tribal leaders while executing others, carefully calibrating his treatment of defeated enemies to encourage submission without creating martyrs who might inspire future resistance. The combination of overwhelming military force and calculated political strategy gradually transformed Gaul from conquered territory into integrated province of Rome. Within 2 generations, Gallic nobles would serve in the Roman Senate, Gallic merchants would trade throughout the Mediterranean, and Gallic auxiliary soldiers would serve in Roman legions across 3 continents. Vercingetorix endured 6 years of captivity in Rome, held in the Tullianum prison beneath the Capitoline Hill, while Caesar's political fortunes rose and fell through the civil war with Pompey. The Gallic chieftain witnessed none of his homeland's transformation, experiencing only the darkness of his cell and the slow erosion of hope as years passed without release or trial. In 46 before Christ, Caesar finally celebrated his triumph. Parade through Rome, the massive celebration that marked his victories in Gaul, Egypt, Pontus, and Africa. Vercingetorix was dragged through the streets in chains as part of the procession, displayed before Roman crowds as living proof of Caesar's conquest. Following the parade's conclusion and in accordance with Roman tradition, executioners strangled Vercingetorix in his cell, ending the life of the man who had come closer than any other leader to driving Rome from Gaul. His death passed, largely unnoticed in Rome, where attention focused on Caesar's growing power and the political tensions that would soon erupt into civil war. The legionaries who fought at Alesia dispersed across the expanding Roman world, carrying with them memories of the 60 days that tested their discipline and courage against impossible odds. Many veterans would speak of Alesia as their defining military experience, the campaign where Roman training and methodology proved superior to raw courage and overwhelming numbers. The techniques developed during the siege influenced Roman military engineering for centuries, with fortification designs refined at Alesia, appearing in campaigns from Britain to Mesopotamia. The double walls that contained and defeated the Gallic Confederation became textbook examples of how properly prepared positions and disciplined defenders could reverse the normal arithmetic of siege warfare. Military theorists would study Caesar's campaign at Alesia for 2,000 years, analyzing the decisions that transformed apparent disaster into comprehensive victory. The Celtic culture that Vercingetorix fought to preserve survived Roman conquest, though profoundly transformed by integration into the empire. Gallic languages gradually gave way to Latin, though Celtic vocabulary and grammatical structures influenced the regional dialects that would eventually evolve into French and other Romance languages. Celtic artistic traditions merged with Roman styles, creating distinctive Gallo-Roman cultural expressions that adorned temples, public buildings, and private homes throughout the province. Celtic religious practices blended with Roman polytheism, with traditional Gallic deities receiving Roman names and attributes while maintaining their essential character. The Druids, who had served as the Celtic world's intellectual and spiritual leaders, found their power broken by Roman prohibition of human sacrifice and systematic suppression of Druidic teaching. Within 2 generations, the Druidic tradition existed only in remote areas beyond Roman control, its knowledge fading as the oral transmission system collapsed under persecution. The transformation of Gaul from independent tribal territories to integrated Roman province created prosperity that exceeded what the pre-conquest period had achieved. Roman roads linked settlements that had previously remained isolated, facilitating trade and communication. Roman aqueducts and public baths brought sanitation standards that improved public health. Roman law replaced tribal customs, creating standardized legal frameworks that protected property rights and enabled commercial development. Roman military protection against Germanic raiders allowed agriculture and commerce to flourish in border regions that had previously suffered constant warfare. The generation born after Alesia experienced peace and prosperity their parents had never known, though it came at the cost of political independence and cultural autonomy. Whether that trade represented progress or loss remained subject to interpretation that varied, depending on one's perspective and position within the new social order. Caesar himself never returned to Gaul after completing the province's subjugation. Political necessity drew him back to Italy, where his rivalry with Pompey would explode into civil war that destroyed the republic he claimed to defend. The lessons learned at Alesia served him well during the Civil War's campaigns, particularly during his siege operations at Massilia and his Spanish campaigns against Pompeian forces. His capacity to construct elaborate fortifications rapidly, his skill at coordinating multiple defensive lines simultaneously, and his ability to maintain legionary discipline during extended operations all reflected experience gained during the 60 days at Alesia. Caesar fell to assassins' daggers 5 years after Vercingetorix's execution, dying in the Senate House. He had dominated through military achievements built on campaigns like Alesia. His adopted heir Octavian would complete the transformation of republic into empire, building on foundations that Julius Caesar's conquests had established. The battlefield of Alesia remained visible for centuries after the siege concluded. The massive earthworks that Caesar's legions constructed eroded slowly under weather's assault, but their basic outline persisted long enough for later historians and travelers to study and document. Archaeological excavations beginning in the 19th century confirmed many details from Caesar's written accounts, discovering the obstacles and fortifications exactly where his commentaries described them. Modern archaeology has revealed the sophistication of Roman military engineering and the scale of operations that sustained 40,000 men in fortified positions while simultaneously conducting siege operations. The physical evidence validates Caesar's description of the campaign, while also revealing details he omitted, including the extensive supply network required to maintain his forces and the brutal efficiency with which Roman logistics operated even in hostile territory. For the people of Gaul, Alesia marked the end of political independence and the beginning of 4 centuries of Roman rule. The confederation that Vercingetorix assembled represented Celtic society's final attempt to resist Roman expansion through military means. Subsequent resistance movements lacked the unity and leadership that made the Gallic rebellion formidable, degenerating into isolated uprisings that Roman governors suppressed without requiring legion deployments from Italy. The psychological impact of Alesia's fall exceeded even the military consequences, demonstrating to Gallic tribes that Rome could not be defeated through conventional warfare regardless of numerical superiority. The combination of Roman tactical skill, engineering capability, and institutional discipline created military advantages that overcome disadvantages in numbers and terrain. This recognition gradually transformed Celtic resistance from military opposition to cultural preservation, as tribal leaders concluded that survival required accommodation with Roman power, rather than continued armed resistance. The memory of Vercingetorix endured through the centuries despite Roman efforts to diminish his historical significance. Medieval chroniclers rediscovered his story through Latin texts that survived Rome's fall, and French nationalism embraced him as symbol of resistance to foreign domination. In the 19th century, Napoleon III commissioned archaeological excavations at Alesia and erected a massive statue of Vercingetorix overlooking the battlefield, transforming the defeated chieftain into national hero, representing French resistance to invasion. The historical reality of Vercingetorix as Celtic tribal leader, fighting to maintain independence, became conflated with modern nationalism's concerns, projecting contemporary political values onto ancient conflicts that operated under fundamentally different ideological frameworks. Nevertheless, the image of the young chieftain surrendering to Caesar on behalf of his people resonated across centuries as symbol of tragic heroism in the face of inevitable defeat. The tactical innovations demonstrated at Alesia influenced military theory and practice throughout the medieval period and into the early, modern era. The concept of circumvallation and contravallation remained standard siege warfare techniques for over 1,000 years, with commanders from Byzantium to the Crusader kingdoms employing double fortification lines when circumstances permitted. The systematic use of obstacles to channel and disrupt attacking forces became fundamental to defensive planning, appearing in castle designs, fortified city defenses, and field fortifications across Europe and beyond. Military engineers studied Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars as technical manuals, learning from the practical details he provided about trench dimensions, tower spacing, and obstacle deployment. The professionalization of military forces that characterized Roman armies gradually spread through societies that encountered Roman power, as tribal warriors and feudal levies proved consistently inferior to trained, disciplined military units operating with standardized tactics and equipment. The broader, historical significance of Alesia extends beyond the immediate military outcome to encompass the cultural and political transformations that the Roman conquest initiated. The defeat of Vercingetorix's confederation removed the final obstacle to Roman control of what would become one of the empire's most valuable provinces. Gaul provided agricultural surplus that fed Rome's urban population, mineral resources that supplied imperial mints, and manpower that filled legion ranks during the empire's expansion. The roads built to move Roman armies became commercial networks that linked Mediterranean markets with Atlantic ports and Germanic frontier regions. Cities founded as legion bases evolved into commercial and administrative centers that survived Rome's fall to become medieval and modern urban centers. Paris, Lyon, Cologne, and dozens of other European cities trace their origins to Roman military settlements established during or after the conquest of Gaul. The infrastructure and institutional frameworks created by Roman administration persisted through the empire's collapse, providing foundation for successor kingdoms and eventually the European state system. The clash at Alesia represented more than military conflict between Rome and Gallic tribes. It embodied collision between two fundamentally different social and political systems competing for dominance in Western Europe. The Celtic tribal organization, based on personal loyalty, warrior honor, and decentralized authority, confronted the Roman system of citizen soldiers, legal frameworks, and institutional continuity. The Celtic worldview emphasized individual achievement and tribal identity over abstract loyalty to distant political entities. The Roman perspective subordinated individual interests to collective goals expressed through republic institutions and legal structures. Neither system was inherently superior in all contexts, but the Roman model proved more effective at mobilizing resources, coordinating large-scale operations, and maintaining discipline under pressure. The 60 days at Alesia demonstrated these systemic differences with brutal clarity, as Vercingetorix's brave warriors and overwhelming numbers failed to overcome Caesar's trained legions fighting from prepared positions under unified command. The human cost of Alesia extended far beyond the warriors who died during the assaults on Roman fortifications. The Mandubii civilians trapped between the lines, the 80,000 warriors enslaved after surrendering, the families across Gaul who lost sons and fathers during the relief army's failed attacks, all represented casualties of a conflict driven by ambitions and principles that cared little for individual suffering. War's arithmetic operates without mercy, counting victories and defeats while treating human lives as expendable resources. The glory celebrated in triumph parades and recorded in historical accounts emerges from foundations built on nameless deaths and forgotten suffering. Alesia's military significance and tactical innovations should never obscure the reality that thousands of people experienced terror, agony, and loss during those 60 days on a Gallic plateau. Their individual stories vanished into historical summary, reduced to casualty figures that fail to capture the human dimension of the events they experienced. In the final analysis, the Battle of Alesia demonstrated principles that transcend its specific historical context. Preparation and discipline can overcome numerical superiority. Engineering and logistics matter as much as courage and skill at arms. Unified command enables coordination that defeats superior forces, lacking organizational coherence. Fortifications multiply the defensive advantage of prepared positions. Psychological factors influence military outcomes as profoundly as material considerations. These lessons remained relevant through millennia of military history, appearing repeatedly in campaigns from medieval sieges to modern warfare. The specific details of Roman military organization and Celtic tribal culture belong to their historical moment, but the fundamental dynamics they illustrated continue to influence how military forces organize, train, and fight. If you found this extraordinary story compelling, subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your engagement helps preserve the memory of these pivotal events that shaped the course of Western civilization.